I was in the middle of a consultation with my most important client of the quarter when my mother-in-law walked into my clinic like she owned the building. Not knocked, not called ahead. Walked in, past my receptionist, past the waiting room full of patients, and straight through the door marked staff only. I looked up from the chart I was reviewing. She was wearing that cream blazer she always wore when she wanted to look like she had authority. My husband was right behind her. And behind him, my brother-in-law, who had dropped out of nursing school in his second year because, in his words, the hours were unrealistic. I set down my pen. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My mother-in-law smiled the way she always did when she thought she had the upper hand. "We need to talk about the future of this practice." Let me back up. I grew up in Sudbury, Northern Ontario. My parents were immigrants. My father worked in the mines. My mother cleaned offices on the overnight shift. We didn't have much, but we had a rule in our house. You work for what you get. Nobody gives you anything. You earn it or you go without. I held on to that rule like a life jacket. I graduated from the University of Ottawa with a degree in nursing, then went back for my nurse practitioner certification while working part-time at a walk-in clinic in the Byward Market. I was 26 years old, sharing a one-bedroom apartment in Vanier with a roommate, eating a lot of lentil soup, and saving every dollar I could. By the time I was 31, I had enough, barely, to open my own primary care clinic in a mid-sized Ontario city about 2 hours outside Toronto. It was a storefront space, renovated on a shoestring in a neighborhood that didn't have enough family doctors. I took patients without a family physician. I partnered with the local pharmacy. I stayed late almost every night in the first year. Within 3 years, the clinic had a team of 4, a 6-month waitlist, and a contract with the regional health authority. It was mine. I built it from nothing. My husband and I had met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's cottage weekend near Parry Sound. He was charming, easy to talk to, had a good job in municipal planning. His family was from a small town in the Ottawa Valley. Old Ontario stock, they like to say. His mother ran the household with a kind of quiet authority that I mistook, for a long time, for confidence. It took me a few years to realize it was something else entirely. From the beginning, his family had opinions about my work. Not hostile ones. At first, just small comments. His mother once said, over a Sunday roast at her house, that it was impressive that I'd built something, but that it must be so stressful running a business. She said the word business the way some people say hobby. Like it was a phase. Like eventually I'd figure out something more sensible. His brother was 28, working part-time at a hardware store, and had a habit of describing himself as between opportunities. He had once told me at a Christmas gathering around their parents' kitchen table that he'd always thought he'd be good in healthcare. The people side of it, he said. I'm a natural with people. I smiled and passed him the potatoes. I should have paid more attention to that comment. I should have understood even then that in their family's mind, being good with people was somehow equivalent to my decade of training, my certification, my sleepless years building something from the ground up. But I didn't see it. Not yet. My husband and I had disagreements, like every couple, but for the most part, things were steady. He supported the clinic in his way. He was proud of it at dinner parties, liked telling people his wife ran her own practice. What he wasn't good at was the quiet parts. The part where I came home exhausted and needed 15 minutes of silence before I could talk. The part where I had to skip his family's Thanksgiving because I had a patient crisis and no one else to cover. His mother noticed those absences and cataloged them. "You work too much," she told me once in a tone that was almost maternal. "A marriage needs tending." I nodded. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, I work too much because I am carrying a mortgage on a clinic, 2 staff salaries, a lease on medical equipment, and the healthcare needs of 400 patients who have nowhere else to go. I kept the peace, It's what I'd always done. The first sign that something had shifted was about 8 months before my mother-in-law walked into my clinic. My husband had been quieter than usual, coming home later, less interested in the details of my day. I noticed but told myself it was stress at work. His department had gone through a restructuring and he'd been worried about his position. Then one evening, he sat down across from me at our kitchen table and said carefully that he'd been thinking. He thought the clinic needed new direction. I set down my mug. What does that mean? He said that his brother had been looking for something meaningful, that he had energy, ideas, a real interest in community health, that maybe there was a way to bring him into the clinic in some kind of leadership capacity. Leadership capacity, I repeated. He nodded. He used the phrase co-director. He said it like it was reasonable. I asked him what, exactly, his brother's qualifications were for co-directing a primary care clinic. He said that not everything was about formal credentials, that his brother understood people, that sometimes what a business needed was fresh perspective, not more letters after someone's name. I asked him if he was serious. He said he thought I should think about it. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to him breathe, and I thought about every year I had spent building something and how little of that he seemed to understand, and whether that had always been the case or whether it was new. I decided in the morning to let it go, to chalk it up to a bad conversation, to his stress, to his family's influence. I told him it wasn't something I was willing to discuss and that I expected him to relay that clearly. He said he would. He didn't. A month later, my mother-in-law called me. This was unusual. We weren't the kind of close where she called just to chat. She asked if we could have lunch. She chose a restaurant downtown, one of those places with white tablecloths and a wine list, and she arrived in that cream blazer. She ordered a sparkling water. She asked about the clinic. She said she'd heard wonderful things from someone in her book club whose daughter was a patient. Then she leaned forward slightly and said that she and my father-in-law had been thinking. They felt the clinic had so much potential. They thought that with the right people in place, it could really expand. They had some connections in the region. Her husband knew people on the hospital board. Her brother sat on a municipal planning committee. With those relationships and with someone like my brother-in-law in a more visible role, they thought the clinic could become something significant. I asked her what she meant by visible role. She said something like co-director of community outreach, that he would handle relationships with local organizations, manage the public-facing side of things, that it would free me up to focus on the clinical work, which was clearly what I was best at. And what would his compensation look like? I asked. She quoted me a number. It was more than I was paying my most senior nurse. I looked at her across that white tablecloth for a long moment. Then I said, very calmly, that I appreciated her thoughts, and that I would consider everything she'd said. I paid the bill. I drove back to the clinic. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes. And I called my lawyer. My lawyer, whom I had worked with since I opened the clinic, was practical and direct. She listened to what I described, the approach from my husband, the lunch, the proposed compensation, and she said, "They're trying to extract equity from your business using your marriage as leverage." She told me to document everything. She told me to review my business structure and make sure my personal and professional assets were as protected as they could be. She told me that if this continued, I needed to think carefully about what I wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. I drove home that night and looked at my husband across the dinner table, and I thought, how long has this been the plan? I didn't say it out loud. I smiled and asked about his day, and I started paying very close attention. Over the next several weeks, I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. Calls that ended when I walked into the room. His laptop closed quickly when I came up behind him. A dinner at his parents' house where his brother made a comment about the direction things were heading and then caught himself and changed the subject. I also discovered Through a contact I had at the regional health authority, that someone had submitted an informal complaint about my clinic's billing practices. It was vague, unsubstantiated, and ultimately dismissed, but it had been filed. I didn't say anything about it, but I knew. Then came the morning they walked into my clinic. My mother-in-law sat down across from me in my office like we were resuming a business meeting. My husband stood near the door. His brother leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, and I noticed he was wearing a button-down shirt, which was unusual for him, like he dressed for the occasion. My mother-in-law said they'd come in person because this was important. She said they'd consulted with someone. She was vague about who, and they believed there was a structure that could work for everyone. She slid a folder across my desk. I opened it. It was a proposal, a formal one, printed and tabbed. It outlined a new operational structure for the clinic. My brother-in-law would be named co-director. His responsibilities included community liaison, stakeholder engagement, and strategic growth. His compensation was listed. There was also a clause about equity, a 30% stake in the clinic to be transferred over a 2-year period. 30% of something I had built alone, with my own debt, my own certifications, my own 7-day weeks for the first 2 years. I looked up. Who prepared this? I asked. My mother-in-law said they'd worked with a consultant. I asked if the consultant was a lawyer. She hesitated. I closed the folder. I set it back on the desk, and I said, I'm going to need you all to leave my clinic now. My mother-in-law started to say something about family, about working together, about how this was an opportunity for everyone. I said, you've submitted a complaint to the health authority about my billing practices. It was dismissed. And now you've brought an equity proposal to my workplace during business hours. I kept my voice completely level. This isn't a family conversation. This is an attempt to take something that doesn't belong to you. The room went very quiet. My husband looked at me with an expression I had trouble reading. I think it might have been surprise. I think he had expected me to be more uncertain, more careful of his feelings, more willing to soften whatever I was about to say next. I stood up, went to my office door, opened it, and said to my receptionist, "Can you call building security, please?" My mother-in-law stood. She said my name in a tone that was meant to sound like a warning. I said, "You can leave on your own or you can leave with security. Those are the options." They left on their own. I went into the staff washroom, ran cold water over my wrists, and stood there for about 3 minutes. Then I went back to my patients. That evening, I called my lawyer and told her what had happened. She said we needed to move quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, we did several things. First, we sent a formal letter to my husband outlining that any attempt to access, leverage, or make claims against the clinic's assets, including through the marriage, would be met with legal action. The letter also documented the meeting, the folder, and the health authority complaint. Second, we reviewed my business registration. When I had opened the clinic, I had structured it as a professional corporation under my own name with advice from my accountant. My personal and professional assets had always been legally separated. The marriage had not changed that. The equity they wanted to claim simply wasn't transferable in the way they imagined. Third, and this was the part I had been quietly preparing for months since that first conversation at the kitchen table, I had already begun the process of formalizing a partnership with a regional healthcare network. I had met several times over the previous year with the director of the network, a woman who had been in primary care for 30 years and who had seen my numbers and my wait list and had been quietly interested for some time. The day after my family left the clinic, I signed the partnership agreement. The clinic would remain under my operational control. The network would provide administrative support, expanded resources, and access to a broader referral system. My position was formalized in writing: sole clinical director, non-dilutable. My lawyer sent a second letter informing my husband's family that the clinic had entered a formal institutional partnership and that any future claims against its equity structure would need to go through the network's legal team, which was, she noted, a very large legal team. We never heard from them again about the proposal. My marriage didn't survive it. I'd like to say I was surprised, but I think I had known for some time that it wasn't going to. We separated about 6 weeks later. It was painful the way that any ending is painful, not because of dramatic scenes, but because of the quietness of it, packing boxes, dividing things that had seemed permanent, learning to sleep alone in the house I'd bought before we were together. The divorce was uncomplicated, legally. My lawyer had made sure of that. The clinic was mine, had always been mine, and remained mine. What was harder was the reconstruction of ordinary life, learning not to check in with someone at the end of the day, cooking dinner for one, sitting in my office after the last patient left and feeling the particular silence of a building that was only yours. But there was something in that silence too, something that felt after a while like relief. About a year after the separation, I got a text from my brother-in-law. He had heard, through someone, that the clinic was expanding. We were opening a second location in a town 30 minutes north, an area with a significant shortage of primary care providers. He said he'd been thinking about healthcare again, that he had been doing some reading, some self-directed learning, that he thought there might be a role for someone like him in the new location. I read the text twice. Then I typed, "I wish you well. Please don't contact me again." And I blocked the number. The second location opened on a Tuesday in October. I drove there in the early morning before anyone else arrived, and I sat in the empty waiting room with a coffee from the Tim Hortons around the corner. The chairs were still in plastic wrap. The receptionist's desk was bare. The sign above the door said the clinic's name, which is my last name, in clean block letters. Outside, the maple trees along the main street were the color of fire, the way they get in Ontario in October, that particular burning orange and red that I have never seen anywhere else in the world. It looked like something that had been set deliberately, like something that was meant to be seen. I thought about my father, coming off a night shift at the mine, too tired to eat before he slept. I thought about my mother, driving home from the office towers in the dark, smelling of cleaning products, hands rough from the work. I thought about what they had given me, not in money, but in the understanding that you don't wait for someone to hand you a position. You build the position. You build the whole structure. And then, when someone comes along and tells you that you should be grateful to give part of it away, you know exactly what to say. You say no, clearly, calmly, without apology. And then you go back to work. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of it, when you realize that the people who underestimated you did you a favor. Not intentionally, not generously, but the effect was the same. When my mother-in-law sat across from me at that white tablecloth restaurant and described my clinic as something that needed the right people to reach its potential, she wasn't trying to push me. She thought she was negotiating from a position of strength. What she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I had been building quietly for years, and quiet people who build things tend to know exactly what they have. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the anger of it, though there was anger. Not the hurt of realizing my husband had been part of the planning, though that cut in a way that took a long time to heal. What I keep returning to is the clarity. The moment I sat in my car in that parking lot and thought, I know what this is, and I know what to do. I think that clarity came from something I learned early, from watching my parents work jobs that asked everything of them and gave back just enough. They never talked about integrity as a concept. They just lived it, showing up, doing the work, not taking what wasn't theirs. That's what I understood doing right from wrong to mean, not as a rule somebody handed me, but as something practical, something you carry in how you make decisions when no one is watching. The intelligence part, knowing what to do, who to call, how to structure things, that came from paying attention. From the years I spent learning not just the clinical side of what I do, but the business of it. From understanding that a good idea isn't protected unless you protect it, I didn't sign that partnership agreement with the regional network because I was lucky. I signed it because I had been building toward it for 2 years, quietly, without telling anyone who might use the information against me. And the third thing, the one that's hardest to talk about because it sounds like something off a motivational poster, is just not stopping. There were so many moments where the easier thing would have been to give them something, to let my brother-in-law have a small title, a corner of something, just to keep the peace. Every time that thought came, I had to sit with it and ask, whose peace exactly? Not mine, not my patients, not my parents, who worked through the night so I could have options they never had. The people who tried to take something from me are still out there somewhere living their lives. I don't think about them much. What I think about is the second clinic, and the patients on the wait list and the staff I get to work with, and the particular color of the maple trees in October on the main street of a town that didn't have enough care before we got there. Which you build with your own hands, your own debt, your own sleepless years. That belongs to you. And when you know that clearly enough, all the way down, it turns out to be very hard for anyone to take it away.